I'm a developer evangelist with Here Technologies, and a wonderful good morning to you all from Berlin, whichever time zone you are in. Today we are going to be talking about the Here routing API and maybe a little bit about some of the other routing related mobility APIs. And to get started, we're going to go to the Here developer portal, developer.here.com. And the first thing you need to do, if you haven't done this already, and I think a lot of you probably have, but if you haven't done this already, you need to click this little sign up button to register for a free Here account. That gives you access to our freemium plan. As you can see, all you need to do is put in your first name, last name, email address, country, a security check. That's it. Step 2 is just reviewing some terms and conditions. And that gets you access to 250,000 API transactions for free every month. So since we're talking about routing, the example here would really be that you can calculate 250,000 routes for free every month. That even includes commercial use cases if you'd like. Once you've done that, you will be taken to your account page where you will be able to generate credentials, which we will soon be using. Okay, so this webinar is about routing, and that means we are going to documentation and we're going into the routing section. And if you've attended the overview webinar from a couple of days back, you've probably already seen me do a simple routing call there and talk about some of the other mobility APIs that we have. We have routing, we have an API for public transit, we have an intermodal routing API, we have a traffic API, and we have a large-scale matrix routing API. We'll briefly talk about all of these, I think, but what we really want to do is we want to get started with the routing API because that's the title of this webinar. If you mouse over, first of all, you can sort of see that this routing API is available in various different flavors. So if you have the REST API, then it is available through our JavaScript Web SDK, and then it is also available through our Android and iOS SDKs. The capabilities are all largely the same. The interfaces are all largely similar in the sense that you would be using similar parameters, or in many cases the same parameters, just in a slightly different interface, depending on what you're using. So for this webinar, we'll really be focusing on the REST API because that'll teach you all of the relevant parameters and concepts, and that you can then apply those across JavaScript or Android or iOS or Flutter or the various other SDKs that we have. Now, when you mouse over REST, you will see that there's two versions of the API. There's a V7 and a V8. So we've recently redesigned a lot of our APIs to have a much more consistent user interface and a much easier to understand user interface. And this is really what V8 is. It is the latest version of the API. And if you've used our APIs before, you may know that if you use the older versions, for example, parameters across these various APIs were actually different, even though in many cases you would have expected them to be the same. So this is really nice. This is really consistent now. You will see for some of the other APIs, the older version might be marked as deprecated. For routing, that's not quite the case yet, because I think not all of the features that were available in V7 have been ported over to V8 yet. But because V8 is the new shiny version, and in most cases will have all of the features you need, this is the one we'll really be looking at today. So that's what I'm going to click on. And as with most of our APIs, when you start up, you get sort of two core things. There might be other things up here as well, but you get two core things. One is the developer guide, and one is the API reference. The developer guide basically helps you with a little more detail, and it'll walk you through some concepts, and we'll probably refer to this later in the webinar as well. For example, if you look at this, you'll get a much clearer idea of what certain elements in the response actually are and what they mean and what the logic behind it is. There's use cases that you'll be talked through here. But for the most part, what I like to do when exploring an API really is dive directly into the API reference. And this is what we'll do now. If we click on API reference, we get authentication and we get our API endpoints. And then also, which in case of the routing API really is just one endpoint, the routes endpoint. This is what we'll be using. You'll see you get all of the parameters explained in decent detail here. And then if you go to the end, you can see all of the responses. And if you click on the 200 response and then click on the various results, you can really open this up and get all of the result details explained as well. And I think what we're going to do to start off is we'll just look at this documentation. We'll fire up Postman as a very useful tool to look at REST APIs. And we're just going to go and we're going to construct a basic routing API call, see how that looks like, and then we'll keep adding parameters to it to kind of see what else is possible, what else can be done, and what other features are available. So let's get started with this. I think Sam in the last webinar reminded me that Postman is actually a partner in this workshop. That's not why I'm using Postman. I'm using Postman because it's great, but that just makes me particularly happy that they are a hackathon partner with us. So let's get started and let's basically get our API endpoint and put that into Postman up here. What we'll always need for all of our APIs is a form of authentication, and we generally support two forms of authentication. One is a Bearer token OAuth protocol, which is really useful if you're doing something in production, or we're also supporting a simple API key authentication, which is really useful, particularly when you are evaluating or just hacking or just playing with the APIs, because there's no complicated token you have to get. All you have to do is use the API key parameter, put in your own API key, which I've set up as a variable here in my Postman. And to get this, like I said earlier, you have to sign up for your freemium account and then go into your project and then generate an API key there. So that's pretty simple to do. So first thing we always need is an API key, which is the authentication part up here. And now we'll look at the query parameters. And we'll see there are a couple of parameters that are required. And really, those are kind of the parameters you would expect, right? What does a routing API do? It gives you information about how to go from point A to point B. That's really what it does. And in order to do that, you need to tell the API, what is my origin? Where do I start? You need to tell it, what is my destination? Where do I want to go? And you need to tell it, how do I want to get there? Which is the transport mode we see up here. Because as it turns out, it really is, you really get very different routes for walking than you would get for a car, than you would get for a truck, than you would use, for example, for cycling and all kinds of other things. So let's do this. Let's put in an origin, and this origin is a latitude, longitude, so a geo coordinate. You can see there are some other place options you can put in there, and we might look at those later on. But for the time being, we'll put in the most simple thing, a latitude, longitude. You see the place options are optional. So for that, we need to get a latitude and longitude, which of course is not necessarily something we have in our heads, even if we happen to know where we are and where we want to go. We don't necessarily know this in terms of let's turn off the traffic here, in terms of an API call. So let's open up, here we go, which is an online mapping service we have, a web mapping service. And let's pick a place So I'm in Berlin here. This is the Brandenburg Gate. This is kind of a famous place in Berlin. And on this wego.here.com site, you can right click anywhere. And then you can just click on see more info and you will get a latitude and longitude displayed here. So this, whenever I need a latitude and longitude of a place for testing purposes or debugging purposes or something, I just go to maps.here.com or wego.here.com and just right clicks on the place and get the latitude and longitude from that. So let's pick this and say our first parameter is origin, and we're copy pasting the latitude and longitude here. So let's go and find some other place to go to. Let's maybe go to, let's pretend we're a tourist. Maybe right now that's a little different, but we can hope for the future. Let's go to the East Side Gallery, which next to the Brandenburg Gate is another famous tourist attraction. It's where they've put up old pieces of the Berlin Wall with kind of artworks on it. It's one of the most Instagram places in the world, so a lot of tourists would want to go there. So we can do this too. And we'd have to click see more because this is a point of interest. And again, we can copy paste the latitude and longitude, and we can say destination. We've got 2 latitudes and longitudes, and then we remember the other relevant parameter that we need is our transport mode, and we can see available we have car, truck, and pedestrian. If you've ever tried the old version, the V7, there are some other ones, including cycling and so on. And like I said, there isn't necessarily a full feature parity yet between V7 and V8. A lot of the concepts we're talking about here are the same between V7 and V8. So even if you were to, for example, wish to use cycling and you would have to go to V7 to use that transport mode, that's okay because a lot of the concepts still apply. It's just that the interface is slightly different. So for example, for V7, it wouldn't say origin and destination. It would say waypoint 0 and waypoint 1, but otherwise would be the same. You would put in a latitude and longitude. In our case, let's just, for simplicity's sake, say we are going by car. So we have an origin, we have a destination, and we have a transport mode. And if I look at the documentation here, I think those are the only 3 parameters that are required, which means we have authentication, a start point, an end point, and a transport mode. So if we send this off now, we should hopefully be getting a response. And we are. And what you'll see is this comes back in JSON, and another good reason to use Postman is that it automatically very nicely formats your response. And you'll see there is a list, an array of routes in here. And in our case, we're getting 1 route. And we'll look later at how to get more routes. But in our case, we just get 1 route. If we do a slightly different API call, we would get multiple routes and alternative routes as well. And then inside the route, we get an array of sections. And if we look into this, we'll also see there's just 1 section in there. And sections really are, in most cases, parts of the route between individual waypoints. And we've only put in 2 waypoints here, a start and a destination. And the routing API has not told us to stop anywhere in between, and we'll see later why it might do this in some cases. So there's really only 1 section. And it gives us essentially a departure and an arrival. And in both cases, it says the type is a place, which is just the generic version of any kind of latitude and longitude you might put in. But as we'll see later, there might be some more specific places. For example, an EV charging station might be a specific place that would be referred to here. And then we get a location. This literally, an original location. This is literally what we put in as a latitude and longitude. And then it gives us a location. And why is the location that the route starts slightly different than the original location we put in? Well, because the routing API essentially snaps the latitude and longitude that we put in to the next road. So let me look at an example on the map. If, for example, we put in this, if we put in this as a starting point, then really driving by car, this is not exactly where you can start. The closest point by car you can start from is probably down here on the actual road. So what the routing API will do is it'll actually say, this is the point you put in, original location, and then this is the point from which the actual route starts, because this is the closest point from which I can start a route. So this is why we're getting a location and an original location. And then it repeats the transport mode. And if you look at this, that's not actually all that helpful, because really all it does is echo back at us that we want to start in a certain place and that we want to end in a certain place, and the transport mode. And the only new information really are these little location bits where it tells us where we actually started it up. That's not usually why we would want to call a routing API. So we'd have to probably put in some other parameters so that it gives us more information. Let's do this now. Let's scroll down the list of parameters here, and we will actually find, if we go down, there is a parameter called return. And this is an important parameter because using this parameter, we will actually define the information that the routing API will return to us. Because as it turns out, there is a lot of information that the routing API can give to us. And if it would just give all of this to us by default, we would get very, very large JSON returns. And so this is also part of the new API. It gives us some very nice ways to clearly define the information we want to get back. So one of the things we can do is we can get a polyline back. This is really useful if we want to end up, for example, drawing on a map. This is a new thing in the new V8 API. It is returned in what's called the flexible polyline format, which is a specific encoding that makes sure that the polyline response, particularly with long routes, does not become very large and unwieldy and takes a long time to transmit. If you go to our GitHub at here maps/flexible polyline, you will not only get information about how that encoding works, but there's also a lot of libraries available for you to use to decode that polyline. Now, if you use our JavaScript API or our routing API on the various SDKs that we have for Android, iOS, and so on, of course, that'll be taken care of for you, and you'll just get map objects you can display on the map. But if you look at the polyline later on, it looks weird to you. Remember that the information on how to decode this is available on GitHub and is also linked out here. Then we have actions. And this is actions such as maneuvers or tasks that must be taken to complete the section. That is probably what we're looking for in terms of actually knowing how to get from A to B. This is slightly different from instructions. Instructions are actually verbal text instructions that tell you what to do. Both seem useful to us. So there's additional stuff like summary, like travel summary, turn-by-turn actions. You can also get elevation information. But I think what we're going to try and look at is polyline actions and instructions, because those are the kind of things that are immediately maybe useful for us. So we'll do this. We'll add the return parameter. We'll say let me see if it's polyline. It's polyline, makes sense. Polyline actions, comma, instructions. So this origin, this destination, this transport mode, and please give us the polyline for the route, give us the actions we need to perform to complete the route, and also give us verbal instructions or text instructions on how to do that. And we'll immediately see the response is a lot longer. Let's look into that now. So again, we have a list of routes, we're just getting one route. And again, we have a list of sections, and we're just getting one section. But immediately we get, as part of this section, a list of actions. And you can see this is structured where it says action depart, duration, and this is the instruction. This is because we also included the instruction return value. So it basically says at the starting point that we have, please depart. So because we're starting off here, and there's an instruction which says head southwest on Pariser Platz, go for 3 meters. And then it says turn left on Pariser Platz, go for 98 meters, and so on and so forth. And it'll actually give you the entire list of actions with instructions in it you need to complete in order to go from A to B. And you'll also see this offset parameter here. This is actually, this allows you, if you use the polyline, to know where exactly, at which exact latitude and longitude, at which exact place you need to perform these actions. And this is where the polyline becomes useful. And in fact, the polyline is required for you to use if you're requesting any other data that has an offset in it. And then we have the departure and arrival. We already had this. Down here is the polyline. You see it's encoded and fairly compact as far as those things go. And that is also information we requested. And that basically gives us a very basic routing API call that gives us the kind of information we would expect from this. I think we probably also want to add the summary, because if we do this, let's see how that looks like. It gives us other information that we would want, which is how long is the route in terms of time, how long is the route in terms of meters. And this is interesting too. It says base duration. So for some reason, the basic time to do this route is 617 seconds. But the actual duration we're expected to drive is 839 seconds. And the difference here is because of traffic, because by default, the routing API takes live traffic into account. And then depending on whether you want to use that or not want to use that, you can use the different durations here. But we'll also look at how to turn this on and off. Okay. Let's go back to the API here and let's have a look at some other parameters that are optional. The first optional parameter we have is the via parameter, and that is actually fairly important because it might be that we would want to put in more than just one waypoint. So if we want to put additional waypoints in, this is the via parameter. With the via parameter, we can put in a list, an array of strings, a list of additional waypoints that the route is supposed to go through. So if we add the via parameter here, let's move this here for clarity, let's move this up here for clarity, and we go back to our map, and we are going to pick, let's say, the Naturkundemuseum in Berlin, which is here, which is a big natural history museum. And we're going to pick this place, and we want to go visit that too. Grabbing the latitude and longitude from that, we can throw this in here. Actually, it makes sense, I guess, to move this in between origin and destination. Not that the order really matters, but I like to have these things in ways that make sense. So we have a via parameter here. You could add additional latitudes and longitudes, and then we get a different longer route. As you can see, the length and duration is now higher and longer, and there's different instructions along the route. And in fact, we would now expect to see two sections, because the first section takes you from origin to the via waypoint, and then the second section takes you from the first via waypoint, in this case the only via waypoint, to the destination. So now we see an example with multiple sections. Okay, let's see what other parameters we could look at. Departure time, that kind of makes sense, right? Because when we're looking at something with traffic, then the departure time might actually be useful. Oftentimes when we're looking at a route, we really know that we're going to be leaving an hour from now, or maybe we're looking into a time into the future. So what you can do is you can actually add a departure time to your route, and you can go and we'll just copy paste this example, which is the easiest way to do it, and then adapt it to, let's say, today's date. So we're going with 2020, and we're going with the with May. Sorry, well, why not May? Let's go with May 1st, and let's say we want to leave at 8 in the morning. And again, you'll see this doesn't necessarily change that much immediately, but it'll have the departure time in here, but more importantly, and this is the interesting thing probably for you, you'll have the arrival time. So you'll, when in this arrival section here, you will actually find out if you leave at 8, when are you expected to leave? And this actually again takes traffic into account. You see the differences here. Of course, we don't know exactly how traffic will be on May 1st, but we have historical traffic data which we can use to make a prediction here, which is very nice. Okay, the next thing is the routing mode, and you can set whether you want the fastest route or the shortest route. So that really means you will get a slightly different optimization. Sometimes the fastest route, for example, taking a ring road around the city at higher speed limits and so on, might be a lot faster to get to your destination than actually snaking your way through the cobble streets of the snaky cobble streets of the city center. So in most cases, you want to use the fastest route, and this is in fact the default. So if you don't set this parameter at all, it goes with fast, but you can also switch to short. Another interesting parameter is alternatives. Sometimes when we call the routing API, we don't just want one route. We don't necessarily want what the routing API picks as the best route. We want to display some alternatives. So what you can say is, for example, show me the 3 best routes that you can do. And you've seen this probably in some routing applications where you start your navigation and you put in your destination and it says, okay, you have 3 options. One route is via this street and the traffic is currently so-and-so, and it'll give you, this is the fastest way for you to arrive, but there are also an alternative. This one takes 3 minutes longer and goes that way. This one takes 5 minutes longer and goes that way. And then you can make a decision which one you prefer and go with that one. And that's a use case that's supported here. And in fact, if we now look into routes, we'll see that there are multiple routes, namely 3 in this list. So now we have a response with multiple routes, and each of those routes has multiple sections because we've asked for alternatives and we have an intermediate waypoint. The next parameter is avoid. This is actually quite a nice feature. And you can avoid various different things. You can avoid features, which is where you'll basically say things like, sorry, where you can say things like, I don't want to drive along a toll road. I know this might be faster, but I have time and I want to save as much money as possible. So you can say, hey, please avoid toll roads. Or you can say, whatever you do, I really don't want to use a tunnel. I really don't want to use a ferry. There's a lot of things in this list here you can look at, but this sort of allows you to exclude certain things on the road that you would that the routing API would otherwise choose for you. But what you can also do is you can define areas to avoid. So for example, if we wanted to avoid a certain area, let's say we know that there is some sort of let's look at a use case where, say, you're having you're a security company and you want to route your armored trucks with lots of banks money through from the banks to your secure warehouse, and there are certain areas of the city you know are maybe less safe. You can literally define an area of the city that you don't want the routing API to ever take you through. And you can define this with various bounding boxes where you'll basically put in 2 latitudes and longitudes for the 2 corners of the area, and then you have a bounding box with 2 latitudes and longitudes you can put in there and avoid. So features you can avoid, where you say, I want to avoid toll roads, I want to avoid ferries, and you can avoid entire areas, and then the routing API will automatically route you around it. Then we have units, and you saw this earlier. The default values are in meters, but that's not useful for everyone. Some places still, for some reason, use imperial. And so you can put this in, and then you'll actually get, you'll see here in the descriptions, you'll see miles and you'll see feet, and this will also affect the things like distance and so on. We'll give you in different in metric or imperial, depending on what you want. Similar for language, you'll see that the default is English at Southwest on Pariser Platz. Now our example here is German, so let's see if we can't switch this over to German. See what happens. I haven't done this. And you'll see it now, the descriptions are all in German. Biegen Sie links ab auf Pariser Platz, fahren Sie 107 yards. Okay, this is a weird combination. If I'm doing it in German, I should probably switch this back to metric. And then it's fahren Sie 3 Meter. So you can switch this into various languages. Let's try, I don't know if this is actually the right language code, but we'll see. You get it in French. Tournez à gauche sur Pariser Platz. Very nice. So you can play with these and make it work for you locally. And if it links out to the standard where you can actually look up the various different kinds of languages. Then we have the return parameter, and this is something we've already talked about. There are some other things you can get in there, for example, elevation or turn-by-turn actions. We can maybe throw in turn-by-turn actions to see what happens, what kind of additional information we might get here. This is something you can experiment with yourself. You'll see the turn-by-turn actions essentially is a more detailed version of the actions, where you'll really see more information where you're in the current road and the next road and how you're turning and so on. So this essentially gives you more detailed directions that allow you to possibly build a turn-by-turn navigation experience in your application. Though if this is the sort of thing you want to build, then there is a feature in the Navigate SDKs that actually comes built in, a turn-by-turn feature navigation. Okay, now here's the thing where it gets a little trickier. Spans. So for example, you can once again include additional information in your sections. And these are various attributes. So interesting here is, for example, let's pick speed limit. Let's put in, I'm going to remove some of those things. We're not going to make it French. We don't need this. We don't need a departure time. We're going to remove the turn-by-turn actions to clean this up a bit. But we're going to put in spans. And no, that's wrong. And we're going to ask for speed limit. I'm going to send this off. And We'll scroll through this. This kind of looks normal, but then we suddenly see another array of spans. And what this does really is it gives you the speed limits along the route. You'll again see the offset for which you can find the location in the flexible polyline. And it basically says from offset 0 to offset 7, the speed limit is 10. This is kilometers per hour. And from offset 7 to offset 9, the speed limit is 50. And then it's 30 and 50 and so on. So you can request for the route, you can request these additional information. You can do country code, for example, if you're having a route that goes across multiple countries and you want to know which parts of the route are in which country, you can get the country route here. You can also get things like, let's pull truck attributes in. I've never done that before. That could be interesting. You can request, let's see where they are. Hope I'm not missing them. It turns out there are actually along those routes maybe no specific truck attributes. It basically just says this route is open for trucks. Okay, that's good. So if we had a truck, we could drive this route. So this is something you can experiment with as well. Throw these things in, see the kind of information you can get here: length, names, dynamic speed info if that's available. So there's a lot of really cool information you can tease out of the routing API using this spans feature. And there's a lot of cool use cases you can build on top of all of that data that comes out of this. So this is well worth looking into. We can't look into all of these because this is just an hour-long webinar, but definitely worth your time looking into. The next thing is really cool too. This is the truck routing feature. So one of the things you need to understand is that driving a truck is very, very different than driving a car. And if you start using a car routing API or a car routing response for your truck, you will most likely get in trouble. Why? Well, first of all, your truck is much bigger than a car. And there are, in fact, bridges that have a certain height limitation, where if you're driving under a bridge, if your vehicle is taller than the space between the bridge and the ground, you will actually crash into the bridge. And I think most of us have sometimes come across these bridges where they have these big yellow stripes on them and signs and these little boards before it that kind of slap the truck on the top so the driver wakes up and realizes he's not allowed to drive here. And still there are pages on the internet where people have just put on webcams on low bridges where every week or something a truck crashes into it. Oftentimes these will be trucks driven by people who are moving, who are not used to driving big vehicles and aren't used to looking out for this. So that is a big problem. Other problems are weight. Sometimes certain bridges only are able to carry a certain weight and it's not legal or safe to drive a big heavy truck across them. In many cases, depending on the size of your truck, there are certain turns you simply cannot take in a truck. So where a car might be able to take a tight turn, no problem, a truck will simply get stuck there. And the last thing you want to do as a truck driver is be stuck in a corner you can't take with a giant truck and then have to back up all the way, lose a lot of time, have a lot of aggravation. And then there's other things like, what are you carrying? Some trucks, you've all seen these kind of hazard signs at the back ends of certain trucks, often tanker trucks, because those tanker trucks might carry something that's flammable, that might poison water supplies, that might be explosive. Some trucks carry, even radioactive materials and so on. So there's these hazardous goods definitions, and depending on what you're carrying, once again, there may be certain routes you're not allowed to take. So for example, if you have something that it's harmful to water, you are usually not allowed to drive near a water reservoir. And you've also probably seen while driving, sometimes seen these road signs where it basically says not permitted for certain hazardous materials. And the routing API actually allows you to put all of that information in. you see here, there's a shipped hazardous goods parameter where you can say, okay, I'm carrying something explosive in the back. I'm carrying something that's harmful to water in the back. You can put in the gross weight of the vehicles. It even goes down to weight per axle. You can put in how high is my truck, how wide is my truck, which length is my truck. You can there are certain tunnels that only allow certain goods to be driven through. You can imagine, tunnels and explosive and flammable stuff does not work well together. So there are certain specifications of tunnels you're allowed to go through and you're not allowed to go through. And you can put all of this in, and the routing API will actually give you a route that is legal and safe for you to drive. And that's quite a big thing, and really a route that will often be completely different from that of a car. And then finally, we have another really cool thing, which is the EV routing use case. So I should point out that this is still in beta, and some of the parameters might change, though I think it's supposed to launch out of beta very, very soon. So I think you can be fairly comfortable using this. And what this does really is it realizes that if you have an electric vehicle, again, your routing might be a little different than if you're driving a normal car. And what this does is it'll calculate for you a route based on your car's battery charge. You can see there are parameters like initial charge. It'll calculate a route based on the consumption of your vehicle. So you can actually put in consumption information, consumption curves for your vehicle. How much battery power does your vehicle consume at certain speeds? You can put in a little curve. We'll see this in a minute. You can put in, how much battery does your vehicle use in traffic? How much battery does your vehicle lose for every meter you go up? How much battery does your vehicle recover through regenerative braking for every meter you go down to little details like, how much battery does the car consume, for example, for lights and air conditioning and so on, even when it's not driving, and so on. It'll calculate you a route and be able to tell you how much energy you're using. But even better, it can dip into our points of interest and places API and get you information on charging stations. And if the route is too long for you to drive with the initial charge that you have, it can actually go and direct you to charging stations and include those charging stations in the route. So let's say your route is a little too long for you to drive on your initial charge in your car. It'll find an electric charging station along the route, drive you there, park you there, tell you to charge your vehicle for, let's say, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, for how long it takes to get enough charge to actually get to your destination, and then route you to your destination from there. This even includes features like you can say, hey, when I arrive at my destination, I want to have at least 20% charge left on my car so I can leave again, and all these kind of things. So really powerful, really cool feature. Similar to kind of the truck routing, which is very specific, different requirements. We have an EV routing, which is very different requirements. Because both of those have a lot of parameters and we don't have a lot of time left in this webinar, I'm not going to use those using Postman, because you would look at me putting in parameters for a long time. Instead, I'm going to find something. Let me see if I've got the right link. I do. I'm going to share with you a little bit of a secret, which isn't really a secret, but something you may not be aware of. We don't publish too much, which is the routing reference client. So the URL is refclient.ext.here.com. And this is essentially a visual client built on top of the routing API I've just told you about. And if you look at the left here, well, there's an origin, there's a destination, there's a via, there's alternatives, there's the return options, polylines, instruction summary. You can click here to switch the transport mode. You can go fastest, shortest, you can do the spans, you can select departure times. This is the EV parameter section. We'll look at this maybe in a minute. Here is the avoid section, and so on and so on. So basically everything we've just went through and talked through is available here on the left, and you can just put in parameters. So we can maybe zoom in here, and if you right click here, you can say route from, and then we can go add via, and then we can go and say route to, and it'll automatically fill in all these things. You can also play with add a void area. So you can literally say, okay, I don't want to drive through this area here. Let's make it a little bigger. Please route me around that. And you can immediately see that reflected here. We see the B box with the 4 relevant parameters. Let's actually just fire this off. We click send down here, and we'll have a nice little route drawn up along the map. We'll start here, we'll go to this, we'll go to this, we'll avoid this area down here. We can actually increase this significantly, send it again, and you'll see it'll route us around this as best as it can. And in this box on the right, you see all of the additional information from the response that we had. We see the sections here with the total duration, so on. We see the maneuvers, which are the instructions that we've gotten, or you can just click on this and show the full response as JSON. Oops, and now I've closed it accidentally. We'll open it up again. One thing we can do here is maybe look at the EV routing parameters. There are some nice presets. So let's pick an 80 kilowatt car. And you can actually see the traffic speed table here. This is something I talked about. This is basically, or actually let's use the free flow speed table, which is better. This is basically where you can define how much battery power does a vehicle use at certain speeds, and you can really define this curve here, change the values, move them about. This is a really weird curve. It's probably not a good idea to switch that up so high. So let's move that to 0.2 again. But this is a really nice way, this ref client, to play with all of these parameters and get a visual response to, which is, I think, particularly with routing, to kind of check what the response and the results are. You often want a visual response more, and as cool as Postman is, it obviously can't be expected to show you and draw you the route on a map for you. That is maybe asking a bit much of Postman. And then this is where this really cool reference client tool comes in. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes left. So what I want to do is give you, we kind of went through the routing API and most of its parameters and talked about the capabilities and fired off some API calls, and we looked at the routing reference client. So we can maybe use a couple of minutes to look at the other APIs as well. So I have talked about traffic a little bit already, and you can see that it's kind of integrated into the routing API. But it's also available either as a REST API or, again, integrated into the mapping APIs. And I'll just show you the way this is integrated into the mapping APIs by going to maps.here.com. Again, this is built with the JavaScript API, the slightly older 3.1. The newer one has very nice vector maps. This is still raster maps, but the principle is the same. If you turn on traffic here, you will see two things. One, you will see that the roads are starting to be color-coded. And this is what's called traffic flow, where the API can tell you for each given road segment, how quickly does traffic flow here? And green means it flows exactly as you would expect it to be at or near the speed limit. And if you have yellow, you'll see traffic is flowing much slower. You're starting to have a traffic jam. And then if you're red, it's really stop and go. And then you might also have black, which basically means the road is just blocked here. There's no traffic going through at all. This is traffic flow, and you can get this information through the REST API as a JSON response, where it'll tell you for this road link we have this type of traffic flow. But in most cases, this is either useful to use in something like the routing API, where it'll happen automatically for you. It'll take the traffic into account for the routes you're driving. Or it's useful to be visualized on a map. And if you use the JavaScript API or use the Android SDK, these are just map layers you can turn on. So in most cases, with a single line of code, you can basically say, on my map that I'm displaying, please show me the traffic flow. And then the other thing you'll see is all of these little markers. These are incidents. And ultimately, flow tells you where the traffic is flowing slowly, and the incidents are telling you why it is flowing slowly. So it turns out that we see some blocked off roads here that are not working, and it turns out there's a broken water main, which was apparently discovered this morning. You actually see a start time and an estimated end time. And this also gives you an idea of how up to date the information in Traffic API and so on is. So literally this morning on this road, a water main broke, possibly on or under this bridge. This is a bridge, so probably a water main under the bridge may have burst, and now there's repair work going on. And they started this repair work at 9:23, which is it's 9:52 here now in Berlin, so it's literally just a few minutes ago that this started. And they have an end time as well, where they're saying in 1.5 hours we expect to be finished with this. And you see there's a road closure here associated with this, and similarly, and you can very often see this too. Here there's no traffic incident associated. Oh no, there is. There's roadworks here and roadworks there. You can see this is a black road. There's no traffic because the entire road is blocked off. Sometimes you see things like traffic accidents that cause the slowdown, and sometimes you see there's just a slowdown without any specific incident associated with it, and that just means that probably in most cases there's just a lot of traffic. This is just a induced traffic jam, and for many of these others it'll be induced by a specific incident. A lot of them are obviously roadworks, but we have a nice example here for something where a water main broke. Sometimes you see traffic jams, but you got to be a bit lucky, quote unquote lucky, to catch those on the map, because they tend to disappear relatively quickly again. So that's the traffic API, which is very nice and useful. And then we have the public transit API. And this essentially gives you, let's go to the API reference again. This is another form of routing API. So let's look at the routes here, and you'll see it works very similarly. You put in an origin, you put in a destination. In this case, because the endpoint is already the transit API, you don't need to put a mode in. And what it'll do is it'll give you a route using public transit. We can actually quickly try this because we still have a couple of minutes. So let's fire up Postman again. Let's put the endpoint in. Let's do authentication. Let's have an origin. Let's have a destination. Let's pick a random start point. It's actually not that random, really close to the office here in Berlin, which is subway station Naturkundemuseum, which when I'm going to the office is the one I use in the morning. Oops, I copy pasted the wrong thing. Let's copy paste this over here, and then we can go to a destination. This is random, it's not where I live. Put this in here. and then just hit send. Oh, I think I need to do this. And you will get a route information using public transit. And again, you'll see the parameters, origin, destination are kind of the same and similar for the response. You get a list of routes and you get a list of sections. Though in this case, there's immediately multiple sections, and you can probably easily imagine why, because when you're doing public transit, you are switching between different modes of public transit. First of all, you have to walk to the next public transit station, which in this case is S-Bahn-Station Nordbahnhof. So it'll give you information on how to walk to that station. That is the first section. And then you get the second section and says, okay, this is a public transit section, and you're starting at S-Nordbahnhof and you're going to S-Anhalter Bahnhof. And you're taking a city train, which is a type of category in Berlin. This corresponds to the S-Bahn. And this is train S1. And it even gives you cool information like the colors, which would be oftentimes public transit lines have certain colors, right? So there might be a red line, a blue line, and so on. Or different modes of transit might have different colors. So in Berlin, the trams are red and the subways are yellow, I believe, and so on. So if you want to display this information on a map somewhere or in some sort of user interface, you can use the right color. And it also gives you the head sign, which is what it says on the front of the train. So if you're at the station and and the train comes in and it says S-Wannsee Bahnhof, then this is the right train you're looking for. There's additional information. This is the transit agency. There's a link out to the transit agency. So all kinds of information. And from there, you then kind of take a little bit of a walk again and get into another train. In this case, you're getting you're taking a subway train, and then finally, for the last step, you're taking a bus. And again, you get all this information. Then from the bus station, you walk to your final destination. So this public transit will almost always have at least 3 sections, which is walking to the public transit station, taking the at least one mode of public transit, and then walking from the public transit station to your destination. But you can see that even though this is a slightly different use case, it still has very similar API response. So if you understand one, you can understand the other. And similarly here, there's a lot of the parameters we know. There's lang, there's units, you can put a departure or arrival time, you can ask for alternatives. There's some other interesting things. For example, you can say, hey, what's the maximum number of changes that I'm willing to accept? Please try to find me a route where even if it takes longer, I don't have to change trains so much. You can say, hey, I really don't like the bus. Please don't, if you can, please avoid buses. And then you can say minus bus under modes. There's a little Easter egg here. There's a spaceship parameter. This doesn't actually work, but it's cool that it's in there. You can even set things like your pedestrian walking speed. I personally find that most routing APIs, including our own, underestimate how quickly I can walk. So increasing this up a little bit is very useful. And again, here there's a return parameter. Oh, also nice, you can say a max distance for walking. So you can basically say, I want to use public transit, but even though it might be faster to take a longer walk to a public transit station that's further away, I really don't want to walk much. So please don't give me a route that requires me to walk for more than 500 meters. Default is 2 kilometers, which is actually quite a bit. So this is something you might want to set down, but it depends on the use case and the density of the public transit network. In Berlin, you can probably set this down a little bit. In more rural areas, maybe not so much. Again, there's a list of return parameters, slightly different, but there's still polylines and actions and summaries and so on. That's a quick overview of the routing. And there's also a next departures, and that basically gives you can think of it as an API that gives you the departure board of the nearby public transit stations. So when you go to a public transit station, a train station, a subway station, on the platform, you will have these departure boards at the top where it says the next train is the U6, it leaves in 5 minutes and goes in that direction. And this is an API that basically gives you that information. And what's really cool about the public transit APIs in general is that they actually have, for many cities in the world, live public transit information. So, for example, both for the routing, but also for this, it would actually know that the train happens to be 5 minutes late. And then finally, what you can do is you can search for public transit stations. So you can basically say, I'm in this location, please give me a list of nearby public transit stations. So you can see this is a very simple API, not a lot of parameters. You can filter by some station options, and that's really it. And then as a final look before we wrap this up and open it up for questions, we have an intermodal routing API. This really is an API that's designed around multimodal transit. So the most obvious use case here is the park and ride use case, where the idea is, for all we've done right now with the routing API or the transit API, I could basically say, hey, I want a route that goes by car, or I want a route that goes by public transit. But what if I actually want a route that combines these two things? What if I want to, maybe I live in a suburb where there's really no public transit station nearby, but driving all the way into the city center where my office is a really terrible idea because I'll get stuck in traffic. So what I really want to do is want to take my car, drive maybe to a nearby public transit station that has good parking, switch into the train there, and then take that train into the city center. And that, for me, is going to be the optimal way to travel. And this is what the intermodal routing API does. There are also some other things. You can use taxi in public transit, and you can use something like a shared bike system in public transit, where you've seen this too in cities where you can now do these bike rentals where you can just grab one of those bikes and drive, maybe drive that to the next public transit station, park it there again, and then take public transit there. So this is an API that you can say currently the following intermodal flavors are supported: park and ride, taxi and public transit, shared bike and public transit. The currently implies that there's more planned there, which is kind of really cool, because when you think about urban mobility, what you really want is you want to combine multiple modes of transit, and this is what that API supports. And again, we can briefly look at the API parameters here, and you'll see it's very similar. It's origin, it's destination, it's via, departure times, alternatives, and then really the transit modes and vehicle modes parameter, where you basically tell the API, hey, which public transit modes, which vehicle modes I want to use. And there's also something like a strategy you can define, where, for example, you want to say things like, I want to enable transit only at the end of the route. So I don't want to start off with public transit, I want to start off with the car. Or you can define things like, I want to park as early as possible, or I want to park as late as possible and then take public transit. So there's various strategies you can define with these various modes here. And then at the end, you see, again, return parameters, quite familiar to us. And this has been me jabbering on for over an hour. I think I've given you a fairly detailed look into the routing API. I hopefully made it clear that all those APIs use very similar parameters. So once we understand the routing API, the routing API response, we mostly understand a lot of these other APIs. I've talked a little bit about traffic, which is maybe a little different from those three routing APIs. I've talked a little bit about transit, which has two additional points, the stations and the departure boards, which might be useful too. I've showed you the routing reference client, which is really a great tool to explore the API and play with it, especially if you want a visual depiction. In fact, I think we've turned on EV routing It doesn't work because I need to go for a much longer route for the EV routing to display. Let's maybe go down to a place where they love electric vehicles. Let's go to California, and let's start somewhere in San Francisco, route from, and go down all the way somewhere to San Diego, route 2, and let's fire this off and see if it works. And then maybe it'll show us also the routing stations, the EV charging stations along the way. So this is a really cool, useful tool. There we go. You can actually see this, right? The route is very different, or somewhat different than if I were to go without EV charging, and it'll actually along the route take us to EV charging stations, charge up the car again, and then the route continues. This is something I still wanted to show you on the reference client. Somehow my browser is really slowing down right now, but you get the idea. And I think that's all I really had for you today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now.
Awesome, thanks, Richard. That's a very useful webinar. Does anybody have any questions? Please raise your hand or enter your question in the question panel on the right. While they're doing it, I have a question for you, Richard. So
Sure.
when you're using a departure time, and that departure time is in the past, is the algorithm using the historical traffic data in the background to calculate the route? Or
you know what? Let's give that a try. And first, let's see if that even works before I give you a definitive answer on something that I haven't actually tried in a while. Let's, okay, actually we have, I think the departure time, we still have that in here. Activate that again and basically say, hey, last year, 2019, we're sending this off. And you can see, yes, that actually works. And yes, that would then be using historical traffic data. In some ways, if you're setting it in the future, it also uses historical traffic data to make a prediction. But if you're doing it in the past, obviously you can use actual historical traffic data.
Okay, great. It doesn't seem that we have questions from the attendees.
Which means I was either completely brilliant and explained everything perfectly, or at this point, everyone is bored out of their minds and is just happy that we're done. I'm hoping for the former.
No, you explained brilliantly. I think it was just like too much information. Maybe people can explore these things in their own time. And yeah, if you have any further questions down the track, you can ping Richard. Richard, have you put your information like the Twitter or your email address or anything that people can reach you?
Give some community resources, which I think is a good idea. First of all, I'm on Twitter and Cieselbeck, so you can just find me there. My DMs are open. We are also, as here developers, we are on, well, that's Twitch, not Twitter. We'll get to that in a second. We are also on Twitter at HereDev, where you can follow us and ask us questions. If you go to the front page of the developer portal and you scroll down, you get some additional resource links. If you have questions and you want to talk with us and you want to talk with the community, I would encourage you to join our Slack channel. Specific technical questions you can also ask on Stack Overflow. We are monitoring this for all of those things. For freemium users, we don't guarantee you tech support, but we really do our best to monitor these and answer questions to help the community, and oftentimes the community will help you too. We're also on Twitch/HereDev. So what you see here, still available, is a session we did on Monday where, oops, it's gone, where we doing a whole season of episodes on how to get started, how to work with their new Android SDKs. My colleague Ray is doing something around Here Studio, and every week on Thursday we have a show called Home Office Hours, where we're just kind of hanging out a little bit, talking about APIs, learning things. You can see some clips that Peter has made. You can look at these to see if this is something you'd be interested in joining as well. So that's a couple of ways you can get more information. You can follow us, you can get in contact with the rest of the community, and where you can ask technical questions and get answers from the team and the community.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I'm going to add one more to the list. The Slack channel of the Hack for Better Days is also available. There are plenty of mentors from different tech providers are there, including ourselves from Here Technologies. So if you can post something on Ask a Mentor, or reach out to the Here Mentors channel, we will be able to assist you as well. Yeah, there's
Cool.
Nothing else from my end. Richard, do you have any final remarks before we close the webinar?
Not really. I'd just like to thank you for joining and say that we're really excited to see what you're building at the hackathon.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thanks everybody for attending. We'll be in touch on the Slack channel, and stay tuned for the future webinars in the next few days as well. All right.
Cool.
And
See you there.
Yeah, take care.